Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. My name is Oak Mountain, and I'm your host. On today's episode, I am speaking with Dolphin Kasper. Dolphin is a consummate coach, transformative communicator, and facilitator of human potential. Co-founder of RelationFlix and founder of Evolve Now, he is dedicated to innovation and providing powerful opportunities for people to improve the depth, quality, and potential of their lives, as well as their most meaningful relationships. In his over 25 years of experience working with people looking for real change and over 2,000 individual workshops or talks, Dolphin has discovered incredibly powerful insights and approaches related to healing our past and to taking full control of our present. From youth to prison inmates to professional athletes, Dolphin has supported a huge variety of individuals from all walks of life to come home to their true nature and to transform their lives through the power of awareness, agency, and love. In today's episode, we cover a beautiful depth as it relates to meaning, masculinity, and how to orient in today's seemingly flipped and polarized culture. I hope you enjoy. Beautiful. Dolphin, thanks again for being here. I know we've engaged in some conversations before, and it's always been fruitful, so I'm very excited to see how this goes. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'll give a real answer. I know sometimes we ask that question and it's reflexive, or the answer is reflexive. Life is super full on for me right now, in some beautiful, enjoyable ways, in some beautiful, not so enjoyable ways. There's a lot of kind of deconstructing and rebuilding, and there's lots of responsibilities at play, and I have my son, and just navigating my relationship with my partner Jess. So things are I feel stretched at the seams, and it's also beautiful that the work I do always brings me back to things that allow me to have perspective in the midst of what feels like too much sometimes in life. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I've always enjoyed our interaction. So I trust that this will be a continuation of that. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And I always appreciate your willingness to give a real answer. I think that's one of the things that I was drawn to when we first met as well. Speaking of being stretched at the seams and these surmounting responsibilities that you're speaking to in terms of work and family, I know the listeners would have had a bit of an intro at the beginning for what you do. However, I am curious for myself and for them to know how it is you came to find yourself in these current roles that you occupy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say it's something like fate or destiny. It's definitely things that I didn't have a picture of when I was younger, growing up and coming into work in my life and vocation. Initially, when I was quite young, kind of late adolescence, early adulthood, I felt kind of directionless. I didn't have a sense of who I was and how that who would be kind of valued in the world. And I think in a way that's what our vocation is about. It's like, how is the truth of who we are and how we want to express ourselves valued in the world? And I think when we get aligned with a career or vocation, those are the pieces that are at play. And I know there's a lot of, for me, there's been a lot of kind of curiosity and question asking around, how does that really want to come through? How does my work really want to come through? And it's still a question, like I've done a lot of public speaking. I've done a lot of different forms of coaching and facilitation, and I love all of that. And it's evolved over the years, and there's been different kind of domains or areas of life that I've addressed with that work and with the kind of skill set that I have. And I'm still discovering, and I'm still listening to my inner world. I'm listening to the outer world and looking for kind of where there's a kind of subtle but clear inner kind of, it's like things kind of click. Sometimes you're looking for something, and then all of a sudden you kind of have been with it for long enough that it clicks into place. And I think that's what I'm listening for. I'm listening for that deeper sort of shift into alignment where I'm like, this. And I've been fortunate enough to have lots to do in the liminal periods between those moments of clarity. But I think, my mom and her journey from a very traditional kind of moderately dysfunctional Jewish middle class family in Brooklyn, New York, and her going, no, like this is not my future, and that she really stepped fully away from the life she was born into. And that was sort of like, my journey was started by her, which maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. We just continue our parents' journey in earnest. But for me, it is about, without vilifying or trying to get away from the world or the life that I have, also listening for what does it mean for me to be true to my real purpose, and what are the implications of that when I find it. So that's been my process and my journey, and it just has me doing these incredible things with incredible people, and I hope and trust that it'll continue that way.
Beautiful. What you said about vocation, Dolphin, really stood out for me, particularly how it revolves around the relationship between the inner truth and that relationship with the world. How is it that this truth is going to be valued? How is it that this truth is going to be received or meaningful? And I'd love to circle back to that idea of valued in the world. But first, I wanted to touch on a piece that I think is maybe overlooked in terms of its efficacy, perhaps because it seems quite simple, particularly in so far as people who are seeking this clarity, seeking this alignment. And that was the piece of listening, and how you were mentioning this inner click. And that click, the word that arose for me was recognition. It's like, yes, there's a familiarity, there's a sense of what I might call inner harmony that comes when we open ourselves to, I might call it a sense of revelation, having the relationship between the inner truth and the outer world, if there is such a thing as an outer world, be revealed through presence and listening. And I think that that's incredibly powerful. So thank you for that little piece there. Now, as listeners are going to become quite familiar, this is not an interview. This is an exercise in discourse and dialogue to uncover together, collectively, meaning and value, something that we can apply to our lives. And so, speaking of value and speaking on the topic of meaning, being that is the theme for season 1, and I've invited you on as an individual to bring value, to bring perspective from the masculine side, I'd be curious what you think about this. There's some schools of thought, or some perhaps maybe not even schools of thought, but groups, perspectives that would put forward the notion that men in this world are valued for what it is that they bring and what it is that they provide. And so when I heard you mention vocation and how is it that my truth would be valued in the world, I thought, how interesting that what might be taken up as maybe a cross to bear, I'm only valued if I bring forth or provide something into the world, has now been contextualized to say that, well, what you provide is valued insofar as it's your vocation, and the difference between sort of innate, intrinsic human value and the value that is provided. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that and the role of masculinity in that piece.
Just the little questions.
Of course, you know what I'm here for.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many places we can go. I think I'm gonna start answering it, and then maybe I'll throw it back to you or check in with you and see if that's where we want to go. Because again, I think there's just so much meat on that bone, and I want to make sure the conversation kind of comes to a place that provides some fulfillment and completion for us, but also for the listener. What comes to me to say is that, in a way, life and its circumstances calls on us to show up with what's needed. And some of my work involves working with two primary contexts. And so there's the context of survival, and then there's the context of evolution. And of course, one needs the other, right? Like we don't survive if we don't evolve and become more adaptable, and we don't have opportunity to evolve if we don't survive. And so there's this kind of interplay between those two. And I believe with human beings, we mostly have evolved in the context of survival. When we didn't know what was around the corner or around the tree, and there were like threats and predators that could kill us, and we didn't know where our food was coming from, to a large degree, whatever we're able to do that helps us survive becomes primary. And so if we look at the kind of sex differences between men and women, there are some meaningful sex differences that allow us to provide something different for ourselves in our own survival, as well as our own provision to the people that we're connected to. And so I think as survival is more kind of necessary, then those characteristics that are involved in those sex differences become more pronounced, and they evolve more in that way, because if we don't use them to their most effective degree in the project of survival, we don't survive, and then those traits don't continue on. So that's sort of like a more of like a scientific frame. But then the question becomes, like, as survival becomes less and less of a necessity, if that's not where all of our time, energy, and resources need to go, what becomes possible, and how does that change the way these differences that we have, between individuals, but also between men and women? What's that for? And for me, it's clear that it allows women to move into and occupy and cultivate more of the kind of maybe masculine side, masculine dominated things, because they're free to do so. The things that they needed to do to survive aren't needed in the same way. And in the same way, men are freed to kind of shift and come into that other space of maybe more vulnerability, more femininity, more softness. And ultimately, I think it's only to our benefit. But the liminal period of that transformation, like I had an interview with a brilliant kind of coach and author, Damien Bowler. I don't know if you know Damien, but he was speaking about like a polarity flip that's occurring right now, where men not just are choosing to, but there's now freedom and safety enough for men to become more like women and women to become more like men. And I think for a species and for our growth and evolution, I think ultimately that flip is to our benefit. But the actual navigation of that flip is a lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication and misinterpretation. And to me, if we want to think about how to travel that liminal period well, it's mostly about simple principles that we know allow human relationships to work, which is really, like, I would say that's the center of our adaptability advantage, is our capacity to have and create and sustain collaborative relationships with each other. And so, if we want to do that, then to me it's like vulnerability, transparency, courage, compassion, care, those pieces, if we can practice those simple principles while we figure out what it means that we don't need men in the way that we used to, and we don't need women in the way that we used to, but for sure we still need each other. So that's my first answer to that question, and I'm curious what you think, and if there's any specific piece of that you want to dig more deeply into.
Certainly. When you're speaking about the polarity and the polarity shifts, one of the words that came to my mind that wasn't specifically articulated was roles. Because when we're speaking about differences, there's a lot of domains in which these differences make themselves pronounced. Obviously, we have biological differences between the sexes. We have temperamental differences, which play themselves out in an average distribution, obviously. And then we also have the, how we might say, enacted or embodied expression of both of those inside of a culture, society, or family. And so when you're speaking about this polarity shift, what comes to my mind is that the enacted roles, that is to say, the literal acts that were the provision of men and the provision of women, in at least some part, are now migrating to the other, or the other are migrating into those domains. And when you speak about adaptability, it makes a lot of sense how the capacity for more people to be able to skillfully fulfill a particular task would be evolutionarily advantageous. that makes sense. The one thing that I think, immediately sort of draws me forward is that there are, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I feel as though there's in every medicine the capacity to be poison. And that if we go too far in the elimination or the negation of relevant differences or relevant temperamental proclivities, that we might actually find ourselves up the creek without a paddle. That is to say, that when we're speaking about, to bring it back to vocation and truth and meaning for manhood, I wonder how much of, and this is maybe not something that you can answer particularly, but please speak on it if it feels true. I wonder how much of the masculine identity or the sense of worth and value for men is or has been derived from this set of roles, from this set of historical and cultural guidelines of how it is that we can be useful, what it is that we are ought to be doing, what it is we ought to be doing. Yeah, curious what you think about those pieces.
Yeah, what comes to me to say is, I would say that growing up and for most of my life, I would have identified as like a progressive liberal thinker, and even my political orientation, even though I don't see myself as a highly political person in the kind of modern human sense, even though I know politics is just a part of being in culture and society. Um, and more as I've gotten older, I've I've felt like my orientation has been more to conservatism. I wouldn't identify myself as a conservative, but I think two things have happened. I think we naturally start to shift more to conservatism from youth to older age. I think that's just a natural evolution of a rightful evolution. I think we're meant to kind of like, I don't think we should be, necessarily shaving our head into a mohawk and dyeing it pink and getting into the streets when we're 85 years old. It's not really the way that stage of life is designed to express itself. Not making that wrong if someone wants to do that at 85, but I just think that as a general rule, that's where we go. We go from more progressive, we challenge status quo, we want to see progress, we want to see change. And then as we get older, it starts to shift. And now there's a historical kind of dynamic of that, and then there's a more cultural and a more local dynamic of moving from progressive to conservative. It's like the conservatism is holding on to and honoring what's worked, which, if you want to create a community or a society or even a family that really works, you don't want to be constantly throwing out what works. It just makes no sense. There's no logic to that. Where conservatism goes wrong is when it becomes too controlling and too rigid and too resistant to the change that life is actually calling for. And so, liberalism or progressivism and conservatism are two sides of a coin that are meant to dance together. And I think that we are in somewhat of a conundrum that you just spoke about, of like, when we shift away from more traditional, recognized and evolved expressions and values and roles, and then we shift to the other side and we make the tradition wrong as a default, we're lost. There's no rudder, there's no North Star, there's no origin to orient ourselves to see where we come from and where we're going. And that's what I see, in modern culture, in spite of the fact that I would happily speak about the horrors of patriarchy and misogyny. To paint the entire history of humanity with that brush is just a totally inaccurate disservice to humanity, and it doesn't help us move forward. So, like, I think there's a lot of mistakes and misunderstanding. I think there's a lot of lack of groundedness and honest self-reflection. And because of that lack of honesty and self-reflection, people use ideology that makes them feel more clear, secure, and in control as the backbone of how they see and engage the world. And unfortunately, a lot of that ideology tends to be about right and wrong, good and bad. I position myself with the ideas and ideals that I believe are right and good, and then anything that isn't that is wrong and bad. And again, it's just a misunderstanding of how we're meant to make sense of what works and what doesn't, what's good and what's not. And so, I think there's lots we could talk about around that, and how we get it wrong and how we can start getting it right. But that's my thoughts on that.
Absolutely. The piece about wrong and right is really potent, particularly because you followed it up immediately by saying what works and what doesn't. And that shift or that refinement is one away from a very reductive and maybe unilateral assessment of action, idea, or role. If we look out at the world and we see, oh, well, this man is behaving in this way and that's wrong, what we've done is we've cut off, in my estimation, the uniqueness and nuance of that entire being in a single instant. And what that does is it actually cuts us off. I think you're maybe saying this without saying this. It cuts us off from a great deal of value that comes from exploring something beyond that standardized norm. And when you're
Yeah.
speaking about, oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, just even when I say, shifting from right, wrong, good, bad to what works, and what doesn't, it's not first obvious what works and what doesn't. Like we could have a whole conversation around how we make sense of what works and what doesn't work. Like I'll give a really gross example. Someone can have a view that is informed by whether they feel emotionally safe and in control or not. And so then whatever they do that makes them feel safer and more emotionally in control will feel like the right thing to them. If that's the paradigm, if that's the reference point for them around whether they're saying or doing the right thing, for people listening, in air quotes, the right thing, that person has no objective or kind of relevant reference point to help them mitigate or counterbalance their own biases and their own preferences as an individual person with a personal perspective and personal interests and values. And I do think as human beings, we're able to open and attune and tap into what you might call a more universal, a more kind of, a more interconnected perspective on what works. But again, what works now doesn't necessarily reflect what works over the long term. So like, I'm just kind of bringing light to the fact that these conversations, if we want to get to the heart of what quote unquote works, I think we can effectively and confidently speak to values and principles and sort of like core logics that sort of like the across time, across culture, across circumstance, these things just work. But as soon as we start to get into like more explicit ideas of solutions to problems, it's so unclear to someone who's honest and has perspective on things what the right thing to do is. And you look at politics, whether we talk about kind of more like North American politics and gender identity and like all that kind of stuff that we're currently kind of navigating through, or you talk about like international, arms politics, that principle that it's not first obvious what the right thing to do is, I think goes everywhere. And I think it should humble us. If we're honest with ourselves and we want to step into the world and have dialogues that make a difference, I think we need to start by knowing that we can't come into any of these conversations with some perfect answer that's going to solve it all. That's just a fantasy.
Agreed. What comes to mind is the difference between orientation and application. And what I mean by that is to say, when you're speaking of the capacity to work in the realm of value or logics or principle as a means of sticking with or discovering what works in the short term and the long term, rather than being able to prescribe a particular set of solutions to any given problem, I think that's the difference between orientation and application. That when we are working in the realm of value and we're working in the realm of principle, what we're saying is, I am going to direct myself based on this map. Now, how I find myself moving across this particular geography, how it is I get over this hill or past this river or what have you, is still in some sense guided by those principles, but is going to necessarily need to be more informed by the explicit details of that circumstance. And so when it comes to men in culture today, and particularly the exploration of roles and what it means to be a man, or to have a meaningful life as a man, I think we can tie that in very powerfully to your sentiment that I would agree with, that it's not obvious what works. And I think the first step, both in terms of exploring meaning from a masculine lens and figuring out what works in general for culture, is getting clear on what the target is. If we want to know or have any hope of valuing the efficacy of a particular method, we need to know what we're trying to do. And so I think one thing I would offer the listeners here is an encouragement to investigate what you find is genuinely valuable. And maybe that is informed by these more traditional structures. Maybe it is informed by history and something that we might call more conservative, or maybe not. Maybe your end is not what we would prescribe, or describe rather, as this more traditional or ancestral value. Maybe it is something that you need to go out and do that is unique and brings a specific and varied contribution to culture. I can't say that. But what I can say is that if we are not clear as individuals what it is we're aiming at, then we are absolutely not going to be clear as a culture for what we're aiming at. And I think the biggest divide we're experiencing right now is that many disparate parts of our social family are aiming in different directions.
Yeah, I love that distinction. I think it's brilliant. I love the articulation is so on point. One of the things that comes up as you're speaking is, this idea that we know better for other people, and I want to contextualize that, because I don't think that that's a wrong idea. It's like sometimes as a parent, you know better than your child, just to kind of bring it into an obvious extreme context. The child at 3 may not know the full realities and dangers of playing near traffic, and you do, and you know better than that child in that way. And you it's not only not wrong for you to, quote unquote, tell your child what to do or actually make them go somewhere else. As a parent, you are responsible to do so. And so where I think it becomes more challenging and where there's more nuance at play is when the power imbalance and the knowledge differential is not so obvious, and the risk is not as clear. And now how do we make sense of, in our interactions with each other, like who holds the rightful depth of awareness and knowledge here? And are we more curious, just as a general way of engaging each other? Am I more curious about, like, where does the deepest level of awareness and knowledge in this interaction exist? And will I orient to that, whether it exists in me or whether it exists in you? If we took that as our primary kind of North Star around how we engage each other, we would learn and grow so much faster. So often we're holding on to some idea that the truth and the control of where things go needs to originate here in me. Now, on the flip side, if I am always deferring to the other, if I don't have a backbone, if I don't have this willingness to be courageous in the face of difficult conversations or interactions, then the truth may be that I am meant to hold the space. I am meant to draw the line. I am meant to, assertively direct things in a certain direction in this interaction, but I shrink away from that because of my own lack of willingness or courage or ability. So, I think what I'm pointing to is that much of our interaction first has to be mystery to us. Like, we can't go into interactions with some rote, memorized, rigid idea that this is who I am, this is who they are, and this is what needs to happen here. We need to come into our interactions where, like, this is a discovery. I don't know what's going to unfold here. I don't even know who I am in this interaction, but I'm ready to find out. And I think that readiness is like child's mind. It's like young children are constantly in that place of mystery and discovery and joy and play. And that's why they learn so quickly. That's why there's so much creativity coming from children, and so much joy is like they're available to the discovery of mystery, and they don't need all these preconceived notions and ideas coming in. So like that feels really important. And the other piece I wanted to weave in is, I think you've heard of the kind of metaphor of like, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail to you. And I think there's a lot of, authors, experts, men's coaches, masculinity coaches that essentially are holding a hammer, and they think everyone needs to be this muscular, powerful alpha male, whatever their picture of that is. And then they prescribe that to everyone. And it's just not that way. Not all men are supposed to show up as and embody and live as these like apex male personas. And I think there's so much trying to be that, and there's so much shame of not being that we miss the whole point. It's like we all have a role to play. And I believe there's differences in the roles that men and women play if we're going to look at sort of like aggregate, but there's more overlap than there is difference. And within the community of men on this planet, there is a staggering amount of variety around what each man, if he's going to be in his full courage, his full embodied masculinity, it's going to look different from man to man. And I think when we get that and we start to accept and love our own place and our own role, the shame starts to fall away, and we start to love our own opportunities to contribute. And that's a different kind of world than I think the world we're currently living in. And the shift is possible, but there's some courage involved, because it involves us letting go of ideas we've been holding for a long time. And many of those ideas have allowed us to feel at least a little bit clear and secure in the midst of a life that feels so scary and insecure at times.
I think that's a perfect time to take a short break and allow our listeners to settle in with that brilliant piece of wisdom, Dolphin. As the first half of our show sets in, I wanted to thank you for listening to the Smiling Human podcast. This show would not be possible without the support of listeners like you. Liking and following on YouTube, sharing with a friend, or following on your local podcast app are all easy and simple ways that you can support this show and help it grow into the future. If you do want to support this show directly, you can consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Patrons get perks like early access to all episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and access to live Q&As with me. If this feels within your means, then please consider becoming a patron. Now let's get back to the show. Awesome. So on the coattails of that glorious and vibrant wisdom, we are going to transition into a segment I'm calling Question of the Week. Being that this show is carrying the motto evolving together through inquiry, each of our guests is asked beforehand to bring a question or an inquiry that is meaningful to them. And I have no idea what it is. So Dolphin, I'll toss this over to you, and please share with me the question that's alive for you.
Yeah, the question that has been there for many years for me, but particularly the last little while is who am I when I'm not trying to get anywhere? And I think there's a second question that's included in that, which is like, how do I move forward from that place? And I want to just tell a quick story that stands out to me, where that question was just unavoidably pervasive in my system. And so my 20s were full of just really cool, pretty well-paying, engaging, and fun work opportunities. Like I just went from job to job that each job was better and more interesting and paid better than the last. And I was kind of living a dream life. And at the end of my 20s, I fell in love with a woman. And it was just like total, complete head over heels, like really would have married her the next day. It was just, I was so in. And we had this really rich kind of 5 or 6 month love affair. And then I got called away on a really cool job contract that I thought was like, I'm going to go away for the summer. I'm going to come back and I'm going to figure out how to spend the rest of my life with this woman. And while I was away, she got in touch. Things had started to get a bit funny as I got ready to leave and as I went away. But the communication was not good while I was away. And then sometime near the end of my 4 months away, she got in touch and said, like, I can't do this. And, I'm not going to get into the details of the kind of how and why of our breakup, but I came back to Vancouver where I was living, and there was just nothing. The contract I had taken meant I left all the kind of projects and work I was doing in Vancouver, which I at the time was fine with. But I came back with like no impetus to do anything, no sense of a next job or a next contract or project. It was dark and rainy. I don't know if you've ever spent time in Vancouver, but in the fall, it's particularly dark and wet. And like two things had always been trustworthy for me in my life. I always ate well and I always slept well. And for probably almost 3 months through that fall into December, I wasn't sleeping well and I was barely eating and I was just lost, like really lost. And I had to let myself go. Like I actually had to let myself, who I thought I was, what I thought my life was, I had to let it all go. And there was a time where it was just empty and dark inside of me. And what happened in that experience was what felt like, I don't know if you've had like a really profound kind of psychedelic experience where you're in this intensity and it's like pressing on you and you feel like it's all going to end, and then somehow you come through the eye of the needle and like the whole universe opens up. And something like that happened, and then a question came. So that it was still dark, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't painful anymore. And the question was, I've given my life away. There's no future for me. But if there was a future, like free of any past, what is worth living for? Like, what can my life truly be about moving forward? And so that experience has replayed in smaller ways. Like that was kind of the most intense that I've ever had that. But this willingness to completely relinquish my hold and attachment to anything to do with my past and anything to do with my identity, and to ask from a kind of empty cup, what do I want to fill my life with? What do I want to have my life be in service to? So anyway, that's the one that I've brought, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, and we can go from there.
Beautiful as always. I feel touched and a sense of deep resonance with what you've offered there. One of the pieces that comes to mind while I was listening is actually something that I noted down when you were speaking about discovery in the previous section. I'd noted down that the courage to discover is predicated on humility and is also one of our prime responsibilities. And so when you're speaking about this, who am I when I'm not trying to get anywhere, or what is worth living for, that's so humble of a question. Inside of this is the recognition that my own faculties are insufficient, or have been at present, to deliver me into a meaningful life. And so what comes forward then is, I still want a meaningful life. I still would like to live a worthwhile life. How do I do that? What is it that I can do, be, say, or orient towards, to use language from earlier, that would result in that piece? I'd love to respond further with a story of my own, because this is very pertinent. When you were speaking, I thought, I've been through something similar. Some folks who are familiar with me and my work would know that I wrote a book in January 2023 is when it was published. But the journey to get there is very, very similar to where you're at. And in fact, the previous June, approaching my 29th birthday, I took stock, so to say. And I started to ask myself the question, if I live on this trajectory, am I going to be satisfied with the legacy that I leave behind? Am I going to be satisfied at the end of my life? The answer was no. If I kept doing the things I was doing, absolutely not. And so this question, what is worth living for, essentially was at the heart of that inquiry as well. If I am to live a fulfilling life, if I do want to leave a meaningful legacy, what is it that would feel like? And so I actually put myself at the very end, and maybe this is something you've done before, but I put myself at the last day of my life. I tried to imagine the very last day of my life, and the last breath that I draw, feeling complete, feeling whole, feeling like I had sung my song, and allowing that seed to grow, this sort of little light that I've used now as this orientation. And I went, okay, if that's what I'm orienting towards, which I would say is non-distinct from a life worth living, or something worth living for, what do I have to do today, this week, this month, this year, to redirect this ship towards that lighthouse? And the quest of The Smiling Human, the book What in the Word, this podcast, all of that has been a result of this question. And I'm curious, and I imagine I might know the answer, but I'll move forward with humility. How much of this particular moment of inquiry for you, Dolphin, do you believe oriented you to the service and roles that you embody now?
Yeah, I would say that, and this is, I think, a good reminder to us, like when we get to the dark cave, it will only ever feel like the end of us. But what's revealed in our conscious choice to enter the cave and to be kind of dissolved into that experience and then to come out the other side is that it's not that what you were before you went into the cave is completely gone. It's sort of more like it's cleansed of its inaccuracies. Like we get cleaned of our unhealthy, dissociated relationship with ourselves in our life. And so then it's like everything that was is still available. It becomes a strength to you. It's like it's the alchemical experience of turning wounds into strengths. That's what the dark cave is really about. And so to me, it's like a trust. Like what came up to me when you were speaking is this distinction between the idea of acquiring a better life. Like, how do I go find it? How do I go and get it? Versus being involved and engaged in the cultivation of the seeds that already exist in you. And I love that. I call it the deathbed exercise, where you draw forward to the end of your life and you go, like, if I stay on this trajectory, how are those last moments in this world? And if I were to create from now until then, from the place of cultivating the life I truly want, how does that feel at the end of my life? And what I love is that for it to resonate, for anyone to do the deathbed exercise, or whatever name you want to give it, I have a kind of a full outline and description of that exercise. If anyone's interested, you can get in touch. But for you to imagine that moment of life and for it to evoke something meaningful in you, it means that it's already there. Like, you don't create that resonance out of scratch. It's like it resonates because that seed of the life you're able to create is already there. And instead of thinking it's somewhere exotic out there in the world that you need to go find and get for yourself, it's like it's right here, right now, with your conscious present choices and how you are with yourself and others, as a co-creative cultivation of that seed that can and really wants to grow into the life that you most want to live. So that distinction and that recognition, that I think for a lot of people, we're really focusing on men today, so I'll just speak to that. Like, for a lot of men that might feel hopeless, helpless, disconnected, grief struck, ashamed, first there needs to be a way for all of that to be okay as it is. And then at some point we need to start to trust that at the heart of us is not that. At the heart of us is not something that is powerless and helpless or ashamed. At the heart of us is a seed for literally every kind of beauty that human beings can express and create. And we get to decide whether and then how we cultivate that seed.
I love the word cultivation here because it really speaks to, I think, the heart of healthy orientation. And this is for masculine and feminine. This is for all beings. When you talked about acquiring versus cultivating, acquisition is it rests on a sense of separation. And when we look at acquiring, it is to say that there's necessarily a sense of lack present. And when we look at that, then our engagements they become, without any other way of being, transactional. That is to say that what is it that I can get from you, and I'll give this, and there's this sort of one for one, tit for tat exchange with this otherness. But when you're speaking about discovery and you're speaking about this presence, the value of the present moment reveals itself through relationship. And I don't just mean romantic relationships, in case there's any ambiguity, but relationship is the space between any apparent two or more. And so when you're speaking about cultivating this part of life, I almost feel as though those seeds, when we speak about the dark cave, they come in the relationship between, it's almost for myself, this is what I'll limit it to, the space between what is comfortable and known and what is really real, to use a term from Jonathan Vervaeke. That is to say that at the very edge of what I am familiar with, what has been acceptable, what has worked, what I'm attached to, and where I want to be, that's the space of cultivation. And when I recognize it as a space of cultivation, then it's in a space that I occupy with the intention of nourishing, with the intention of bringing value to, rather than acquiring or extracting value from. Mm-hmm. It's like you cannot harvest in your garden, for all of you green thumbs out there, without tending to the soil, tending to your seeds, weeding, watering, and being a steward in some sense. And so when we're speaking about this pursuit, and this is probably a beautiful note to surmise, we are stewards of our life. And we're also the stewards of our relationships. And when we were speaking about power earlier, the recognition that our power, and you mentioned it here previously, the power to choose what it is that we're choosing is kind of irrelevant from the fact that we always have the power to choose. And therefore, the opportunity to make the choices that would reorient towards cultivation, that would reorient towards meaning, towards discovery, and this evolution versus survival are here. They're with you presently. And if you don't see them, that's okay. I would encourage you to inquire, because I like to say that nature abhors a vacuum, and any question will evoke an answer either from within or from this greater intelligence. So beautifully said, Dolphin. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I love that metaphor of gardening. It might be the most apt metaphor for living life and engaging relationship. And, if we want to kind of draw that metaphor out a little bit more, and then I have a question for us, unless you have somewhere else you want to go, which is fine with me as well. We're born into a certain plot of land. Like some people are born into paradise, like all the stuff is there, and there's all these people that know how to farm and grow and steward the land, and it's just utopia in a way. Now, there's still difficulties of life and difficulties of learning how to be there, but some people are born into pretty amazing environments, and other people are born into the desert. And I think modern culture is one where there's a message that says it doesn't matter what you were born into. It's like, what can you get for yourself? but that's like fast food. That's like leaving whatever plot of land you're on and going wherever you can get the cheapest, fastest, most sort of immediately gratifying sustenance. And whereas that feeds you on a certain level, it doesn't nourish you, and you never learn how to cultivate whatever land you're on. And I think that's where we find ourselves. And I think it's going the divergence of that, like human beings that really know and understand how to cultivate connection and relationship and healthy living, and humans that don't, is going to continue to separate. I think there's going to be more and more of a divide there, and there's going to be fallout from that. So, I'm not a kind of utopianist in terms of just assuming it's all going to turn out rosy. I think it might get really, really quite rough. But I have ultimate faith in life itself. And maybe that's the best place to place our trust, is like life knows what it's doing, in spite of how insane human beings can be and how much we can just make a mess of things. Ultimately, life will figure out what it needs to do, and it may or may not include us. But while we're here, I think our choices matter a lot, more than we can know. And I think where I was curious to go, unless again there's somewhere else you want to go, is like, how can we make that more practical and tangible for the audience? So I think we've explored and laid out some pretty neat framings and clarifications of things that hopefully were of value. But I'm also curious for those people that are on this path of like personal growth and development, and also know that in some way their growth and development is meant to then be in service to more than just themselves in their life. How do we, make real more of these things that we talked about? So I'm curious about that. I'm curious your thoughts, and of course you're driving the ship, so let me know.
Absolutely. I love the distillation into the practical. One of the things that people asked me when I was doing my academic studies in philosophy was, what are you going to do with it? And I had a cousin of mine said, you should become an applied philosopher. Like, what's an applied philosopher? He said, I don't know, but you should become one. And so let's put that into practice. Now, I think the key is, as we mentioned before, a clear goal and a clear orientation. And so for those who are looking to, for lack of a better word, cultivate these choices and this type of orientation, my encouragement would be to write out, perhaps in response to these questions or questions I can provide as examples, what kind of man do I aspire to be? What actions does that man take? Or how is that man of service to his family, community, and culture? And what are my thoughts and actions that are standing in my way from becoming that man? Those alone set you up with a target, an action plan, and a first step. Because I guarantee you, to anybody who asks themselves this question, what am I thinking and doing that is standing in my way of achieving this particular end? If you're truly honest with yourself, you'll know. An answer will come through. And at that point, you are finding yourself at the nexus of decision. Will I continue to make this choice that I now know is an impediment to the cultivation of this meaningful life, to this act of service, to this embodied expression of my fullness? Or will I choose differently? And I think that something that's really come through for me lately in blinding and almost stupefying simplicity is that choice is the seat of power. And if you want to live differently, you must choose differently.
Yeah, so good.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Brother.
I would echo those. I would echo those pieces. I was working with a client recently, and she's really into Christian mysticism, and so I'm someone who I recognize, like, all of the words we use, they're labels, but they're just signposts. They're pointing to something, and so I always want to get into the full kind of vocabulary and vernacular of the person I'm working with, so that the examples I use and the metaphors and the kind of pieces that we explore are as close to what resonates in them, that points to those truths, as possible. And so, we've been getting into kind of God and Jesus and Christianity more than I maybe normally would. I don't have any aversion to it, but it's not necessarily my central way. But I think most of the people listening will have probably heard of the concept of what would Jesus do? This reflective practice of relating whatever Jesus is to you, what he represents, the flavor of him, the way of him, and allowing your relationship with that to inform what your sense of him being in the world in your circumstance. How would he be and what would he choose? And it doesn't have to be Jesus. I think for a lot of people, he resonates as the highest expression of humanity. But for you, whoever represents the highest expression of humanity, and if you're a man and you want something more local to you, who represents the highest expression of being a man in the world, and allow your relationship with them and what they represent to you to inform what you think they would do in your circumstance. And I believe that's a proxy. I think it's a good place to start if we don't yet have our own center. But ultimately, what we find in that practice, if we engage it a lot, is that what allows us to make sense of what this embodiment of the highest expression outside of ourselves would do is that it is in us too. Like that capacity to recognize what the quote unquote right thing to be or do is, it's already there, and we've just lost touch with it, and we don't know how to attune to it, and we don't know how to kind of do a translation of its raw kind of vibration or flavor, and what the explicit things to do are. All of that can be learned. And so I think the first practice, on top of what you've already said, is identify who that highest expression is and start to do that practice. What would so-and-so do? How would they be with this? What kind of thoughts or beliefs would they carry in relation to what's going on for me? And instead of getting into your old way of thinking, which is often connected to disconnection and a sense of disempowerment and not having what you need to make your way, just listen for the honest answer to that question. And as soon as you have an honest answer, just do it. Like don't think about it. Don't second guess. Don't think about what if I fail. Just do what your best sense of that is. And that will be transformational for you. And then the other thing that I would say is that that's great. And there is nothing like direct relationship with those embodied examples. So as soon as you're able to, find people, places, and environments within which you can have and hold and sustain relationships with men that are that for you. And that might feel scary, like especially if you've had a rough go, and maybe your relationship with your dad is not great, and your relationship with men has struggled. Like this is not an easy ask. I recognize that. But what I also recognize is that in a certain way, creating and sustaining relationships with people involves skills, it involves the development of ourselves. The intention is crucial. It's the centerpiece. But if we don't have a lot of experience relating to and cultivating healthy relationship with men, it's going to be a multi-year project for that to become fluent in you. Like you will need to stay with it, and you'll need to make mistakes, and you'll need to be rejected, and you'll need to do all of that over and over and over again. And what I know is that when we start to consciously take the time to go, where are the people that are living in the way that I want to live, that are creating the life that I want to create, and we put ourselves there consistently over time, that's where life ends up going. I think it's Stephen Covey, like you become like the 5 people you spend the most time with. It's true. It's just the way we are. We absorb each other. So that piece you said about choice, I talk about agency, but I feel you're talking about the same thing. This, you, in spite of your past, in spite of the state of your life, you have agency. First, your agency is not what you do. First, your agency is how do you choose to be with what's currently occurring in your life? From that choice to accept it more fully, to say yes to what is currently happening, what I call the possibility space opens up. So all of these things that felt totally alien or cut off or unavailable to you a moment ago, all of a sudden start to kind of shimmer into awareness. Like, oh, I could do that. Or, oh, I don't have to do that anymore. Or, oh, this is going to be hard, but I'm ready. So in a way, this agency to say yes to life, to be in acceptance of life as it is the primary doorway to real transformation. And then there's the whole follow through of living life. But I think those pieces that we just shared at the end here are I'd love to kind of listen back and write them all down and maybe create a little ebook with them. Like, it's really, really good, practical, effective stuff. And if you're ready, step in. And of course, Oak and I, and there's lots of other men in the world that are really on a path, and we want you to join us. So that's a kind of warm invitation, whether it's us or someone else. I don't care that much. I just really want to support and invite people to step into themselves and into the life they want consistently over time.
Beautifully said, brother. And for those who are looking to make that choice and perhaps investigate your offerings and your wisdom a bit more deeply, where is it that they can find and connect with you, Dolphin?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my writing ends up on Facebook. I'm just in the process. I have like hundreds and hundreds of articles that I've been writing over the years that are going to start to show up on, I think I'll probably use Medium and my personal blog on my website. So dolphinkasper.com is a primary place. So DolphinKasper.com. There's, you can get in touch, learn a little bit more about me. There's some videos. There's ways to kind of book a call with me if you want to chat. Instagram, I'm going to be starting to share more there. YouTube, I'll start to share more there. I have a podcast, the Best Relationship Podcast. We're probably going to rebrand soon. And Facebook is where I share a lot of my kind of it's like my notepad. So if you want to kind of be up to date on what's currently moving for me, then Facebook is a place. And because of my name, I'm super easy to find. So please reach out.
And of course, all that information will be in the show description as well for anyone who's interested. Dolphin, it's always a joy and a pleasure. I appreciate the wisdom that you bring into this world and this conversation. So thanks again for being here.
Oh, total pleasure. I look forward to whenever next is. I know we'll do it again.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Smiling Human Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing on YouTube or giving a follow on your local podcast app. I know I said it in the mid-roll, but I'll say it again. If you'd like to support this show directly, you can do so at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. You'll gain access to perks like early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes content, as well as access to live Q&As. Also, I've just produced an insight journal and I want to give it to you for free. You can find access to this month-long personal development journal in the link below. This is in the show notes or in the YouTube description. Also, if you feel inspired by the sharing that has taken place in conversations like this, and you want to work with me directly, you can find a link to a free call below. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you again.